Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're tackling something that honestly affects every single one of us, even if we don't always realize it.
Ooh, mysterious. Hit me with it.
We're talking about managing and preserving records. And yes, I mean both those piles of paper threatening to engulf our desks and that, let's be honest, ever-expanding digital black hole we all carry around.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But where are we starting with this? I mean, it's a pretty broad topic, right?
You're not wrong. Luckily, you've shared some really insightful material that dives deep. No pun intended. Like, from the very first moment a document is born to, well, potentially ending up in some dusty archive 100 years from now.
Sounds like a wild ride. What's the game plan?
Well, the mission here is to sift through it all and extract those golden nuggets of knowledge. To equip you, dear listener, with a solid grasp of how it all works without drowning you in technical jargon.
Love it. Efficiency and clarity, that's what we're all about. So what kind of stuff are we actually looking at?
Honestly, the sources you sent cover a surprising amount of ground. Strategies for organizing documents, the whole life cycle of a record, the intricate process of how archives describe and preserve things, and of course the ever-growing role of tech in all of this.
And that last bit's key, isn't it? I mean, the digital world has completely reshaped how we handle information.
Absolutely. But even if you're thinking, hey, I'm not running a library or a government agency, this stuff is still relevant.
You're right, it applies everywhere.
Whether you're, trying to finally conquer that home office chaos, wrangling files for a small team at work, or maybe you're just curious about how institutions handle those mountains, literally mountains of data they generate every day. Understanding these core principles, it's like a superpower for, well, just about anyone.
It's about gaining control, right? Making sure that critical information doesn't just vanish into thin air, but is actually accessible when you need it, whether it's next week or 10 years down the line.
Precisely. And what surprised me digging into all of this is how much strategy and thought goes into even the things that seem super basic. Like just naming a file on your computer or deciding how long to hang on to a specific document. There's a whole system behind it.
It's not just random, is it? There's a real method to the madness.
Not at all. So to give everyone a little roadmap for our deep dive today, we're going to kick things off by looking at how organizations, big and small, can effectively manage their documents. Then we'll journey into the fascinating realm of permanent archives, those records deemed worthy of, well, sticking around for the long haul.
The chosen few,
Yeah.
The historical VIPs.
Exactly. And finally, we'll wrap up by exploring how those vital records are described in a way that, actually makes them findable and usable, both now and way into the future.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's talk document management and organizations. Where do we even start?
So right off the bat, one of the things that really stood out to me from these sources was the idea that there are some essential prerequisites, some non-negotiables that have to be in place for any system to actually work.
Oh yeah, the foundation. You can't build a house on sand, as they say.
Exactly. So first and foremost, you need solid, consistent support from the top dogs, the leadership. Without that buy-in, any efforts, no matter how well-intentioned, they're likely to fizzle out.
Lack of resources, people dragging their feet, classic signs that leadership isn't fully on board.
Right. You also need, and this makes perfect sense, a clearly defined mission for document management. Like, what are you actually trying to achieve? What's the overall goal?
You usually see that laid out formally in a policy document or a directive of some sort. Makes it official, gives it weight.
Exactly. And the third crucial ingredient, surprise, surprise, is resources. Not just, throwing money at the problem, but also having enough dedicated staff who are actually trained and, passionate about implementing and overseeing the whole system.
Makes sense. Because even the best plan in the world will fall apart without people to make it happen.
100%. And it was fascinating to see how this whole importance of document management really scales with the size of the organization.
Oh yeah, totally. It's not one size fits all, is it?
Nope. So even a small team, like let's say 20 people, they really benefit from having someone, even if it's just part of their role, who's responsible for this stuff. But once you hit that 100-employee mark, it becomes absolutely essential.
Things can get out of hand pretty quickly, right?
Oh yeah. The sheer volume of information flowing around, it can quickly turn into like an information tsunami if you don't have a good system in place.
Total digital chaos.
Yeah.
And speaking of chaos, the sources highlighted some really common frustrations that organizations often face, which ultimately push them to start thinking seriously about better document management.
Lay them on us. I bet a lot of our listeners are nodding along already.
Oh, for sure. So the first one, and it's a classic, is employees wasting countless hours trying to track down the information they need.
The elusive file. The black hole of the shared drive. We've all been there.
Then you have, poorly classified documents. Things that are either labeled so vaguely that they're practically invisible or, the opposite, where everything's categorized with such insane precision that it's impossible to find anything.
The needle in the haystack syndrome.
Exactly. And then there's the dreaded multiple versions of the same document floating around, with no clear indication of which one is the most current or, God forbid, the actually approved one.
Oh, the version control nightmare. I've seen entire projects derailed by that.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And finally, and this one's a real killer, it's when everyone in the organization has their own unique and, let's be honest, often completely illogical way of organizing things.
Every folder a mystery, every naming convention a secret code.
Exactly. And then imagine what happens when that person leaves the organization.
Yeah.
Or, you're trying to collaborate on something with them. It's a productivity black hole.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture of what happens when document management goes wrong. Now, let's talk solutions. Where do you even begin to tackle this kind of information anarchy?
So, according to the sources, the most fundamental first step, the one that underpins everything else, is establishing a clear shared classification framework. It's about creating a logical and consistent way to categorize every single document within the organization.
So before you even think about fancy software or filing systems, it's about having a shared language for how you talk about information, right?
Absolutely. That shared understanding is key. Now, to make things even clearer, the sources actually break down organizational activities and the documents they spawn into 3 helpful categories.
Okay, break it down for us.
First up, you've got what they call mission-related activities. These are, the core functions of the organization, the reasons it exists in the first place. Then you've got support activities, which, as the name implies, are there to, support those core mission-related things.
Okay, so far so good. And the third category?
And this one's a bit more nuanced. It's the essential activities. Now, these represent a much smaller percentage of the overall documents, maybe 1 to 5%, but they're absolutely crucial for keeping things running if, disaster strikes.
Like if the proverbial stuff hits the fan.
Exactly. So to make this more concrete, the sources use a city as an example.
Oh, I like this. Makes it relatable.
Right. So let's say you're thinking about the documents a city government generates.
Shoot.
The mission-related stuff. That's going to be your infrastructure plans, roads, utilities, all that good stuff. Permits for construction, renovations, keeping the city running. Then things like records related to, having fun. Parks and recreation programs, registrations, all of that. And of course, the dreaded tax records.
Can't forget those. Essential for keeping the lights on. Right.
Literally.
Yeah.
And all of these, they're directly tied to the city's core function, serving its citizens.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about those support activities? What would fall under that umbrella?
So support would be all the stuff that keeps the mission-related things humming along smoothly. Financial management, budget documents, accounts payable, all the financial statements, and then IT resource management.
Oh, so even the systems for organizing information, that falls under support activities.
It's all connected. And it highlights how important this stuff is. Now, those essential documents, the disaster preparedness ones, the sources don't give specific city examples, but you can kind of extrapolate.
Okay, let's speculate. What kind of documents would a city absolutely need to keep safe and accessible in case of, I don't know, a major earthquake or hurricane?
Definitely those critical infrastructure blueprints. Anything you'd need to rebuild, emergency response plans, step-by-step guides for dealing with any kind of crisis, key legal documents proving ownership, all those essential agreements, and probably personnel records, contact info for key people, all that. Anything to get essential services up and running again quickly.
Wow, yeah. That really emphasizes the varying levels of importance documents can have. Some are just, day-to-day operational stuff, but others are absolutely vital for survival in extreme situations.
Absolutely. Now, once an organization has a handle on what kinds of documents they have, there's another crucial tool they need to implement.
Hit me with it.
The records retention schedule, sometimes called a conservation schedule or a disposal schedule. But the core idea is the same. It's a formal plan that outlines how long different categories of documents need to be kept.
Oh, so it's not just a matter of hoarding every single piece of paper or every digital file forever.
Definitely not. In fact, that would be a nightmare. The point of a retention schedule is twofold. First, to ensure those important documents, for legal reasons, operational reasons, whatever it might be, they're preserved for as long as necessary. But just as important, it provides a clear system for getting rid of stuff that's no longer needed.
Decluttering on an organizational scale. Makes sense, actually.
Right. It prevents clutter, obviously. Frees up precious storage space. Reduces the costs of just, keeping all this stuff around.
Less is more. Now, the sources emphasize that a good retention schedule needs to be practical, user-friendly. If it's too complicated, people just won't use it.
Exactly. It needs to be easy to understand, easy to integrate into people's daily routines. The simpler, the better. Now, let's talk tech, because the sources also delve into document management systems, which is really where technology takes center stage.
This is where things get really interesting.
So the adoption of these systems has really exploded.
Sure.
And for a few key reasons. The sheer volume of information is just mind-boggling. Everyone's creating digital documents. It's everywhere.
It's like a digital avalanche.
Totally. And then you've got the challenge of information being scattered across, a million different computers, shared drives, with no real centralized control.
Each department its own little information island.
Precisely. Add to that the increasingly strict requirements around data security and compliance, and you can see why document management systems have become so essential.
They're like the superheroes of the digital age. So what do they actually do? What's the magic?
Well, at their core, they centralize everything, storage, management, the whole shebang. and they come packed with a ton of really useful features.
Give me the highlights.
Okay, so first you've got capture, which is basically the process of getting documents into the system in the first place.
Like scanning paper documents or, just saving stuff directly from your computer.
Exactly. Then you've got the whole management suite. This covers things like controlling who can create and edit documents, access permissions, keeping track of different versions of a document, applying metadata, which is basically descriptive information about the document like author, creation date, keywords, and, very importantly, handling the whole lifecycle management of records.
Which ties back to those retention schedules we talked about, right?
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So the system can actually flag documents that are, approaching their expiration date, so to speak. Now, beyond management, these systems also handle the storage and organization of documents.
Both physical and digital?
Ideally, yes. So for digital, it's all about server infrastructure, storage capacity, backups, security, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, and what about physical documents?
So for physical stuff, the system might not actually house the documents themselves, but it'll keep track of where they are, their metadata. But the actual physical environment, temperature control, humidity, all that jazz, that still needs separate attention.
Right. Can't just chuck irreplaceable historical documents into a damp basement.
Exactly. And finally, these systems also provide ways to access and share information, but in a controlled way.
So you can have different levels of access for different people, public versus internal, all that.
Precisely. Internet for public stuff, internal intranets for employees, shared workspaces for collaborations. It's very versatile. Now, to give you a real-world example, the sources talk about a municipality implementing one of these systems.
Oh, perfect. Back to our city friends.
Right. So the first step would be integrating their existing classification framework, their retention schedules, and then this thing called the metadata registry.
Okay, metadata registry sounds a bit intimidating. What exactly is that?
It's actually pretty simple. Think of it as a master list of all the different pieces of descriptive information, the metadata fields that you can attach to different types of documents. So for a city, this registry might have specific profiles for infrastructure plans, building permits, tax records, employee files. You get the idea.
So for an infrastructure plan, you might have fields for project name, location, the engineering firm involved, all those specifics.
Exactly. And having that standardized metadata makes it so much easier to search and retrieve documents later on. Now, another interesting aspect is how they handle historical records. Those mountains of paper that have accumulated over decades, even centuries.
Yeah, that's a whole different beast.
Right. So in this case, the municipality first microfilmed all the older paper documents up to the year 2000, and then, for anything more recent, they went straight to digitization.
A two-pronged approach. And the key here was to do it in a way that, preserved the legal validity of the records.
Exactly. So those microfilm or digital copies could legally stand in for the originals. And then the paper, after careful checks, could be, disposed of responsibly.
Makes sense. So the old stuff gets a digital or microfilm stand-in, but how does that fit into this fancy new document management system?
Even though the old records are physically on microfilm, the system still has a digital record about each microfilm file.
Okay, so it's like a bridge between the physical and the digital.
Exactly. So it'll have descriptive information, maybe extracted from old finding aids or, by examining the documents. And crucially, it'll have the physical location info, the microfilm reel number, the frame numbers, all that.
So even if you need to go back to the actual microfilm, you can easily locate what you need.
Exactly. And for certain historically significant records that needed to be permanently digitized, those microfilms were eventually scanned.
A gradual process of bringing everything into the digital realm. Now, what about getting rid of documents? I mean, not everything needs to be kept forever.
Right. That's where the retention schedule comes back in. So the system can actually automatically flag records that are, eligible for disposal.
Based on those predefined rules.
Exactly. Then a report is generated, goes to the document management team, they review it, and then the relevant department, the ones who originally created the documents, they give the final okay.
A multi-step process with checks and balances.
And in this case, the municipality had a plan to systematically dispose of old microfilm that had met its retention period by 2015. So it's not just random deletion. It's very deliberate.
Very methodical. So it's clear that organizations have to be just as thoughtful about disposing of records as they are about preserving them. Okay, let's shift gears now from managing day-to-day documents to those records deemed worthy of long-term preservation. We're talking about permanent archives.
Yes, the historical heavy hitters.
Exactly. The memory of the past, as one of the sources so nicely put it. And it really struck me how these permanent archives, they only represent a tiny fraction of all the documents ever created.
It's like the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that really highlights the importance of careful selection, making sure that what ends up in an archive is truly valuable, both now and for future generations. The focus here is on preserving authenticity, making sure that the records are what they claim to be.
Yeah, no forgeries allowed.
And then maintaining their meaning and their context, and of course ensuring their physical integrity through, all those professional archival standards and practices.
That's a big responsibility. So how do they actually decide what's worthy of this kind of like VIP treatment?
That's where the collection policy comes in. It's a fundamental document for any archive, laying out exactly what they will and won't collect.
Oh, like the rule book.
Exactly. So it'll consider things like where the records come from, their provenance, their format, whether it's paper, digital, audiovisual, what have you.
Right, because archives can't just take everything. They need boundaries.
Exactly. And the policy also spells out how they'll acquire materials. Will they accept donations, purchases, bequests through wills?
Lots of options.
And it'll also outline the responsibilities of everyone involved, the archive, the donors, the whole shebang.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. So
Yeah.
any interesting real-world examples of these policies in action?
Oh yeah, a couple of good ones. One is the acquisition policy for private archives at the Université Laval in Quebec, Canada.
So that would outline how they decide to accept, personal papers, family histories, things like that.
And then there's an example from France, which actually has laws in place to protect historically significant private archives.
Wow, so the government can actually step in and, like, prevent important documents from being sold off or disappearing.
Precisely. It highlights how seriously some countries take this whole idea of preserving their historical heritage. Now, once an archive has its collection policy sorted, how do materials actually, end up in their hands?
Right. How do they get from point A to point B?
So the sources describe a few different entry procedures.
Multiple paths to archival glory.
Exactly. One common route, especially for government or institutional archives, is through transfers from what they call intermediate archives.
Okay, so there's like a middleman.
You got it. It's basically a temporary holding place for records that, aren't actively being used anymore, but haven't yet reached that final decision of keep or toss.
So it's like a waiting room for historical judgment.
Exactly. And then, once they've been appraised and deemed worthy of permanent preservation, they get transferred over to the main archive.
Okay, so that's one path. What are the others?
You also have direct transfers from the departments or agencies that originally created the records. This happens a lot with newer archives or maybe ones that haven't yet established that formal intermediate stage.
Makes sense. And what about private archives, personal papers, things like that?
Those typically come in through various means. You have outright gifts or donations. You have bequests specified in wills. And archives might even directly purchase materials if they have the budget and it aligns with their collection policy.
Okay, so sometimes they're actively hunting for specific items to fill gaps in their collection.
Precisely. And then there's this interesting concept of a deposit.
Deposit, like putting money in the bank.
Not quite. It's more like a long-term loan, but with the archive taking care of the physical preservation and access.
So the original owner still technically owns the material, but the archive holds onto it and makes it available.
Exactly. It can be a good option for people who, aren't quite ready to fully give up ownership, or maybe for government bodies that aren't allowed to permanently donate their records.
Okay, I see. A temporary but responsible solution. Now, with all these different ways that records can enter the archive, how on earth do they keep track of it all?
That's where some essential tools come in, primarily the accessions register.
Accession register sounds very official.
Oh, it is. It's basically the official logbook of everything that comes into the archive. It's the legal record of transfer.
So what kind of information gets recorded in this hallowed tome?
Well, it'll have a unique accession number for each batch of materials, the name of the donor or transferring agency, a brief description of the contents, the date range, the quantity, like how many boxes or volumes, and where it's being stored initially within the archive.
So it's like a super detailed intake form.
Exactly. Now, in addition to the accession register, they also use transfer lists, sometimes called transfer schedules.
Okay, so two separate but related things. What's the difference?
So the accession register is the broad overview, just confirming that, yes, the archive received these materials. The transfer list is much more granular. It's a detailed inventory of the actual documents or series within a specific accession.
So it's like the itemized receipt. Right?
Precisely. Ideally, it's created by the transferring party before they hand over the records. It acts as a preliminary finding aid, giving the archivists a better understanding of what they're dealing with.
Okay, makes sense. So accession register for the big picture, transfer list for the nitty-gritty details. Now, once all this stuff is safely inside the archive, what happens next? It's not just a matter of stacking boxes in the basement, right?
No, not at all. The next crucial step is archival arrangement.
Arrangement. So this is where they actually start, like, organizing the chaos?
Exactly. It's all about bringing intellectual and physical order to the materials.
And I'm guessing there's a whole system for how this is done, right?
Oh, yeah. It's not just random. First, they have to identify those individual units of description within the accession. So, figuring out what belongs together, what constitutes a series, a file, all of that.
Okay, it sounds meticulous.
It is. And then they arrange those units in a logical, hierarchical order, usually starting with the broadest category, like the entire collection or funds, and then working their way down to, individual items. And guiding this whole process is the super important principle of provenance.
Oh yeah, provenance. We've definitely encountered that term before. Remind us what it means in this context.
Sure. Essentially, it means that records created by the same source, whether it's a person, a family, or an organization, they need to be kept together. You don't mix and match stuff from different creators. It's about respecting that original context.
Keeping things pure.
Exactly. And the sources actually break down provenance into three key concepts.
Okay, give us the rundown.
First, you've got, respect for provenance itself. You maintain those records from each creator as a distinct, separate group. No intermingling.
Got it. What's next? Then there's respect for the integrity of the fonts. So you don't go cherry-picking items from one collection to create some kind of artificial grouping. You keep it whole. And finally, you have respect for original order.
Okay, so if the original creator had some kind of, filing system or a way of organizing their stuff, you try to maintain that as much as possible.
Exactly. Now, you might be wondering, why is this whole provenance thing so important?
Yeah, good question.
Well, it's because that original order, that structure imposed by the creator, it often provides super valuable context about the records themselves.
Ah, so it's not just about being neat and tidy. It's about preserving meaning.
Exactly. It can tell you why the records were created, how they relate to each other, their significance. If you start messing with that original order, you risk losing that crucial information.
Okay, I'm convinced. Provenance is king. But practically speaking, how do archivists even begin to tackle this?
So they usually work with a hierarchical structure, and it starts with the fonts, which is basically the entire body of records created by a single entity.
Okay, so that's like the top level container.
Right. And then within a fons, you might have sub-fons, which are, more focused divisions, maybe different departments within an organization, or different aspects of a person's life.
Okay, starting to get granular.
Then you've got series, which are groupings of records related to a specific function, activity, or subject. And these can be further divided into sub-series if needed.
So it's like a branching tree of information.
Precisely. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have files, which are, the individual folders or bundles of documents.
And this structure helps them to both physically arrange things and to describe them in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. Now, of course, real life is messy, and sometimes those neat categories get a bit blurred.
Oh, I bet. Well, what are some of the challenges archivists encounter?
Well, one common one is dealing with what they call mixed fonts.
Mixed fonts. Sounds like trouble.
It can be. It's basically when records from different creators have gotten all jumbled up over time.
So it's like a historical jigsaw puzzle.
Totally. And archivists have to play detective, looking for clues within the documents themselves, trying to figure out who created what and how it all fits together.
Sounds like a challenging but fascinating job.
It definitely is. Another challenge arises when an organization's structure changes over time. Departments merge, get dissolved, all that.
Which can make it really hard to figure out how to group records based on their original context.
Precisely. So how do archivists actually get started with this whole arrangement process? What's step one?
They typically begin with an initial assessment, a kind of preliminary investigation to get a basic sense of what they're dealing with.
Like a reconnaissance mission.
Exactly. So they'll assign a temporary control number to the entire accession. They'll identify the creator if that's not already clear. They'll give it a preliminary title, write a brief description of the contents, and they'll determine the overall beat range.
Okay, so getting the lay of the land.
And they'll also do some basic processing. Maybe remove obvious duplicates, separate different formats like photographs from documents, that kind of thing, just to make things a little more manageable.
Right. Now, after that initial assessment, the next step is to develop a more detailed arrangement plan. This plan will ideally reflect the original creator's own organizational structure, or maybe their major activities if it's a personal collection.
So they really try to stay true to that original context.
Absolutely. And they also need to consider whether the fonts is considered open, meaning the creator is still active, or closed, meaning it's complete.
Okay, so an open fonts might need more flexibility built in, knowing that new materials could be added later on.
Exactly. Now, once they have that arrangement plan, they need a way to physically organize everything and, make sure it doesn't get lost in the archives.
And that's where those control numbers come in.
You got it. Archival control numbers, sometimes called quotation, they're like unique addresses for each unit within the archives.
So you can easily find and retrieve what you need.
Precisely. Now, the sources make a distinction between an article, a file, and an archival box.
Okay, let's unpack that. They all sound kind of similar.
So think of a file as the intellectual unit. It's a group of documents related to a specific topic or transaction. Ideally, one file would equal one article, which is the unit that gets assigned a control number.
Okay, so in a perfect world, one file, one number.
Right. But sometimes a really large or complex file might span across multiple physical containers, like folders or boxes.
Ah, so that's where the distinction comes in.
Exactly. So each of those physical containers would be considered a separate article, and get its own control number.
Okay, I'm following. And the archival box is just the, physical box that holds one or more articles.
Exactly. It's the storage unit. So to summarize the whole arrangement process, you can break it down into 5 key steps.
5 steps to archival order. Let's hear them.
First, you identify and define the fonts. Figure out exactly what belongs to that creator.
Sure.
Second, you assign that fonts a place within the archive's overall classification scheme.
So where it fits in the grand scheme of things.
Right. Third, you gather as much info as you can about the creator, their context, how they organize their stuff.
Context is everything.
Absolutely. Fourth, based on all that info, you develop that detailed arrangement plan. And finally, fifth, you physically arrange the records according to that plan, assign those control numbers, and put everything in its designated spot.
Beautiful. Organized chaos transformed into, well, just organized. Now, once everything's arranged, how do people actually find what they're looking for? I mean, these collections can be massive.
That's where archival description comes in. It's all about creating finding aids.
Finding aids, like a map for navigating the archives.
Precisely. They can be paper-based, but more and more they're digital resources that help researchers understand what's in the collection and how to find specific things.
So it's the bridge between the, sometimes overwhelming world of archives and the people who want to use them.
Exactly. Now, just like with arrangement, there are principles and standards that guide the creation of these finding aids.
So tell us about those guiding principles. What are the archivists aiming for here?
A core concept is multi-level description, which basically means you describe the archives at different levels of detail. So you'll have a high-level description of the entire fonts.
The big picture.
Right. And then more detailed descriptions of series, subseries, files, even individual items if needed.
So you can zoom in or zoom out depending on how specific you need to be?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to avoid repetition, information that applies to a higher level, you don't repeat it at the lower levels, just the essentials.
Efficiency and clarity. I like it.
Right. Now, no matter what level you're describing, there are 3 absolute essential elements: the reference code that links back to the physical arrangement, a description of the contents, and the date range.
Okay, the bare minimum info to give you a basic understanding. And what are the different types of finding aids that are typically created?
Good question. So you've got inventories, which are the most detailed, often listing every single item.
Wow, very thorough.
Then you have registers, also called repertories, which usually describe things at the file level.
A bit broader.